Well, good morning, everyone. Well, today we're going to finish the book of Acts. We're going to look at Acts chapter 28, the last chapter of the book. And this follows directly on the narrative that John, I know, was so great at bringing to you last week, chapter 27. In chapter 27, remember, Paul was on his journey from Caesarea to Rome, and he encountered a few little problems along the way, right? There was a hurricane force storm that he had to endure, and the ship was battered. It ran into a reef, and when it was on that reef, the waves smashed up against it and broke it up. Everybody had to get off the ship. Nobody was lost. They swam or they floated to the island, and that's where we're going to pick up the narrative today in chapter 28. And it says on verse 1, once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. Sort of interesting here, they didn't know where they were. They had to find out where they were, and they found out that where they were was this island called Malta. Now, Malta is in the Mediterranean Sea. It's a small island, very small, actually. It measures about 19 by 7 miles. So to put that in perspective, if you looked at an area from the 55 freeway to the southern border of Orange County, and from the 5 freeway to the mountains, that'd be the size of Malta. It's pretty small. And even today, the people of Malta are much like they were 2,000 years ago. It was sort of a heterogeneous group that was made up of Italians and Greeks and North Africans. But because it was a small island, they had similar ethos. You know, they had a community of interest, and they all got along well together. And today, the Maltese are known for their hospitality. They're very friendly people. They go out of their way to be nice to each other. And even though it's cross-cultural, it's very homogeneous. In the island today, much like many Italian towns, there are these neighborhood rivalries. So like in Siena, they have the, what's it called? The Palio. The Palio, where each neighborhood enters a horse into a race, and they have this horse race, and the horse that crosses the finish line first, whether it has a rider on it or not, and frequently due to large consumptions of red beverages, the rider falls off. But the horse that comes across the finish line first, that neighborhood gets the bragging rights for the next period of time. And that's sort of the ethos of Malta today, and it was that way back 2,000 years ago as well. And it says in verse 2 then, that the islanders showed us unusual kindness. Unusual kindness. I love the way that Luke characterizes things. He's very specific. He doesn't say kindness, unusual kindness. That means they really went out of their way. And they built a fire and welcomed us all because it was rainy and cold. Well, we know it was wintertime because the ship was on their voyage during the winter. That's why they ran into the bad weather. They shouldn't have been sailing at winter, but you know, God had his reasons for it, right? But it was raining and cold, and the Maltese built them a fire. Well, in verse 3, we see that the fire may have been dwindling a little bit. So it says, Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and he put it on the fire to stoke it up, to keep it going, so they could get warm. And in that brushwood was a viper. Now, a viper is a broad-headed snake with hinged fangs. Like our arms are hinged, that's the way a viper's fangs are. And a rattlesnake, for instance, is a viper, something we're familiar with around here. And it says that the viper, when they was in the brushwood, and when Paul put that on the fire, because of the heat, the viper wanted to get out of that situation, and he fastened himself on Paul's hand. I'm sure you've all heard this story a number of times, but we'll just all go through this again. And it says in verse 4, when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer. For though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." Well, the misfortune of the viper attacking Paul to the Maltese was evidence of sin. And they were sort of surprised that the misfortunes that he had at sea did not revenge his sin, but now the viper is going to be used to revenge his sin. And that's their mentality. That's what they're looking at here. And this goddess Justice here is an interesting persona. There's two goddess justices. One's Greek, one's Roman. The Greek one is known for her wisdom, her counsel, and most importantly, she was supposedly the interpreter of God's will. So that's how why the Maltese are thinking, well, obviously, God's will is to revenge Paul's sin. Now, there was a Roman goddess of justice also, who was introduced by the Emperor Augustus. And this was sort of a newish god, hadn't been around for a long time. And her name was Josephia or something like that. And this is the one you see at the courthouse, you know, with the blindfold and the scales and the, I don't know, Book of Moses or whatever they have in their other hand. But this is who they're latching onto to be the arbiter of Paul's sin. Well, Paul in verse 5 says, he just shakes off the snake into the fire and he suffers no ill effects. So this is sort of a nanny moment, you know, for Paul. You know, you think I sin and that's what's happening to me. I'll prove you wrong. Boop, get rid of the snake. In verse 6 it says, the people expected him to swell up, sort of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, and suddenly fall dead. So, and it says, after waiting a long time and seeing nothing happen to him. So this sort of reminds me of people that go to auto races, you know, and they sit around for a long time waiting to see if something bad happens. That's what's going on here. They're waiting a long time to see what's going to happen to Paul, that he's going to fall over dead. But nothing unusual happened to him. He survived. And they changed their mind. And they called him a god. So talk about flipping the coin here. He's a sinner, he's deserved to die. Oh, no, he's a god. Let's worship him. Pretty crazy times. Now, just as a sidebar, snakes are an interesting thing in the Bible. If we go back to Mark 16, it says, and these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well. So this was something going on in that time where God used the handling of snakes, presumably, as an evidence of his power and his strength and his mercy. Now today we have certain sects that do the same thing. I would propose that the time for having that happen is past, and we don't need to challenge God to show his mercy and his strength by handling snakes. But in those days, they did use that. And I think the Bible attests to that. Sorry. So there's clearly a supernatural event for Paul. He handled the snake bit him, and he survived. And the people now say, he must be a god. Well, in verse 7 it says there's an estate nearby. Not just a house, but an estate. Pretty big deal. And that belonged to Publius. Now Publius was, before I go there, I forgot to tell you, this is not the first time Paul was thought to be a god. If you remember back in chapter 14, Sonny probably talked about how when he healed the cripple in Lystra, people said, you must be a god. You were able to heal this person. So this wasn't the first time that Paul was thought to be a god. Well, anyway, so now they go to the estate of Publius. Now, Publius was the Roman governor of Malta. And he also showed exceptional hospitality, it says in verse 7, that he showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. Now, Publius is sort of an interesting character. There's actually a Publius in history who was the first bishop of Malta. Might be the same guy. Don't know for sure. That Publius in history was martyred for his faith. So maybe Paul converted him? Don't know. Maybe he was a Christian before Paul got there? Don't know. But there was a Publius, and not a common name, I don't think, who was on Malta. So it says that he showed them generous hospitality for 3 days. Now, there might have been a reason that Publius showed him that hospitality and wanted him into his house. And we see that in verse 8, because it says his father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Now, the fever that he was suffering was probably gastric fever, which was caused by a microbe found in goat's milk, which is very common in Malta. And of course, dysentery is a widespread ailment due to poor sanitary conditions. It's the extreme bowel problems that can lead to death. But because Paul was able to survive the attack by the serpent or the snake, the viper, maybe Publius knew that and said, hey, this guy's got special powers here. Maybe he can help Dad, because Dad is sick. And it says that Paul went in to see him in verse 8, and after prayer placed his hand on him and healed him. So Publius got his will, didn't he? And it says in verse 9 that when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. The rest, does that mean everyone that was sick on the island came to Paul to be healed? Maybe. It says the rest that were sick came to see Paul, and they were cured. So in verse 10, it says the result of that is that's everybody on the island, honored us. Now notice in Acts, we have this first person plural pronoun of us. So it's Luke and Paul. Luke is observing this firsthand. We can count on his narrative because he was there. He saw it. This was not hearsay. He was there. He saw all this going on. It said they honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with supplies as we needed. So they were able to give them everything they needed to go on with their journey, to provision them for their journey. And it says in verse 11, after 3 months. So they were there on Malta for 3 months. Now here's an interesting thing to me. Pregnant pause. Want you guys to get ready. There's no commentary that any evangelism was going on. Isn't that a little curious? I mean, that's Paul's raison d'etre, to bring the gospel to people. But Luke, for some reason, doesn't talk about any evangelism, any preaching, none of that. He ignores it. We know that something was going on. Paul couldn't have been there for 3 months and not done anything. He wasn't working on his tan because it was winter. So, but it says for 3 months, it says in verse 11, for after 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered there on the island. So there was a ship there that had the sense not to sail during the winter like the ship Paul was on that got shipwrecked. And it was there, and that's the ship that Paul was going to take to go on further in his journey. And it says it was an Alexandrian ship. So that means this was a ship that was coming from Egypt. It was probably a ship that transported grain of some sort, probably wheat. Egypt at that time was a province of the Roman Empire, and it was sort of used as the breadbasket for Rome. So sort of like the San Joaquin Valley is for us, you know. That's the way Egypt was for the Roman Empire. And Paul, Luke, in his usual specific way of describing things, he describes the ship in a little bit of detail. And he says in verse 11, the ship with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. So on the bow of the ship were these carvings of Castor and Pollux. Now, Castor and Pollux were mythological Greek, I think they were gods, but most important, they were thought to be the protectors of sailors, and that's why they were on this ship. You know, much like the Orthodox community looks to St. Elmo as being the protectors of sailors in our culture. And it says, we put out, in verse 12, they put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. Now on the back of your outline there is a very poor map. I'm sorry. For some reason I couldn't find one that I could actually copy that was very clear. But you'll see the distance from Malta to Syracuse isn't very far. It's only 150 miles. So it probably took a couple of days or 3 days to sail there, and they landed at Syracuse, and they stayed there for 3 days. Syracuse is a very important city. It's on Sicily, and tradition holds that even though Paul was only there for 3 days, he established a church. And the picture that's even worse than the map on your handout shows the ruins of the church that tradition says Paul established there. Then in verse 13 it says, from there we set sail and arrived at Rhegium, I think it's pronounced. The next day a south wind came up, and the following day we reached Puteoli. Now Rhegium is on the southern tip of Italy. It's only 85 miles away from Syracuse. They waited for a favorable wind this time. They're getting smarter. And they landed at Puteoli, I think is how it's pronounced. And that's in the Bay of Naples, very near Pompeii. And Puteoli is the main port for Rome. Think of it as the Long Beach of Rome. That's where all the container ships come in, except they don't have them then, they just have grain transports. It's a very important place. That's where all this foodstuffs come for the city of Rome to be fed. And it says there in Puteoli, you like my accent? Pretty good, huh? Puteoli. I better use my hands. Puteoli. They say they found some brothers and sisters. So apparently Paul and Luke went out to seek brothers and sisters there. They purposed to find brothers and sisters. And it says, and they invited us to spend a week with them. Again, this gift of hospitality is paving the way to make Paul's journey to Rome, his ultimate goal, happen with as little effort as possible, even though he was shipwrecked. But that was because they weren't exactly obedient, maybe. And these brothers and sisters demonstrated the gift of hospitality, again, to Paul and Luke. Now, it might interest you to see that there's brothers and sisters there. That means there's believers in Rome. Now, this is written about 58 AD, so that was only about 35 years after Christ's death and resurrection. And yet we see believers in Rome. Rome is 1,500 miles away from Jerusalem. So the gospel is spreading worldwide. It's in Rome already. And Paul finds these people. And then, this is very curious to me. The whole reason for this book, not the whole reason, one of the important reasons is Paul is getting to Rome. From the very beginning of his journey, that's his goal, to get to Rome. And yet, in just 6 words at the end of this verse, it says, and so we came to Rome. It's like, oh hum, we got there. Now we're done for that part of our journey. You would think that there would be more excitement about it maybe, or a little reflection. But no, Luke just says, and we got there. Sort of, I guess he expected to be there. So in verse 15, when they're in Rome, that says, and the brothers and sisters there, so there were brothers and sisters, believers in Rome, they heard that they were coming, the news of Paul coming spread, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. The Forum of the Appii Forum is 43 miles away from Rome. The 3 taverns are about 30 miles away. So the people from the Forum, the Appia Forum, would have probably traveled to the 3 taverns, overnighted there, and then gone on to see Paul. This just gives some amazing evidence of the appeal that Paul had, that people were willing to. That was not an easy journey. That wasn't like jumping in your Uber and getting to LAX. I mean, this was a difficult journey to go 43 miles. And it was important enough for these people to see Paul that they would do that. And because they did this, it says, at the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. And who wouldn't be encouraged to have people come to acknowledge you and to pay their respects and to want to learn from you? And then we go to verses 17 through the end of the book. And this is Paul's 6th and final defense of his faith as recorded in Acts. And it says in verse 17, 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. In every other case, the Jewish leaders came after Paul. They saw Paul was in the town, and they came and they wanted to talk to him. In this case, interesting, Paul called together them. He reached out to them. And I think that's significant, and we're going to dig into that in just a minute. Now, these Jewish leaders were probably the leaders from the Roman synagogue. And it says further in verse 17, when they had assembled, Paul said to them, my brothers, and Paul's always great about this. He always personalizes his dialogue. Remember back when in chapter 26 when he was talking to Agrippa and Festus, he'd always say their name, like King Agrippa, and then he'd go on and say something, or Festus, and then he'd go on and say something. And here he wants to personalize this message. He says, my brothers, although I have not done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. So this tells me that these Jewish leaders probably didn't know why Paul was there or what charges were being brought against him. Paul had to tell them. They were ignorant of why Paul was there. And so Paul is telling him about the events that are bringing him there. And he defends whatever charges might be brought before him by saying he's innocent in how he deals with people. He's never done anything against anyone. And even more importantly, it says that he's done nothing against the customs of our ancestors. Now, the patriarchs are really important to Jewish leaders and in the Jewish culture. That's where they're hanging their hats. And Paul's saying, I haven't done anything against that. But here I am. I was arrested and handed over to the Romans. And verse 18 says that how that all happened. He said, they examined me, that would have been the Jews in Jerusalem, and that trial in front of Agrippa and Festus, it says they wanted to release me. They wanted to release him because he hadn't done anything wrong, because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected because the Jews wanted to put him to death, right? Remember. So I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. To save his own life, he had to appeal to Caesar, because he knew if he was going to go back to the Jerusalem society, those Jewish leaders would have him killed. Remember, they were waiting for him to ambush him even, and we saw that a couple times. And then he says that in verse 19, I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my people. And verse 20, for this reason, I have asked to see you and talk to you. So Paul is relating his experience, and because he knows that the Roman Jews don't know what's going on. But his real reason is in the last part of verse 20. He says, it is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. What is the hope of Israel? The coming Messiah and his kingdom. And that's what Paul wants to share with these people. That's why he's there. Well, in verse 21, it says that they replied, that is the Roman Jews, we have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. So this confirms the Jewish leaders didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize about this big kerfuffle that was going on in Jerusalem and Caesarea. And even though those charges had been leveled more than 2 years ago against Paul, remember, he was in Caesarea for 2 years before he set sail for Rome. It sounds like this was sort of a local issue against Paul in Jerusalem. It wasn't across all of Judaism, all of Judea, all of the Jewish faith in all the various locations around the world. It's mostly in Jerusalem, and that sort of ties into the point that I made a couple weeks ago, that one of the key issues here was those local issues, local leaders, were not so interested in maintaining spiritual purity of their faith as they were interested in maintaining power. If they were interested in maintaining spiritual purity, I think the word about Paul would have spread more widely. It's also interesting that when it says that the brothers and sisters greeted Paul, they knew what was going on. They valued him, but the Jewish leaders in Rome didn't have a clue. So there's a little disconnect here. Well, verse 23 says they arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. Oh, excuse me, I missed something. Verse 22. But the Jews said, we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect. People everywhere are talking against Christianity, not necessarily Paul, but against Christianity, the sect, which was known at that time as the Way. People were talking about that. The Jewish leaders are a little confused. They want to know more about it. So in verse 25, they arranged to meet Paul on a certain day. They made an appointment with Paul, and they came in even larger numbers. So this great group of people came to hear what Paul have to say. And it says in verse 21, he witnessed to them from morning till evening. He was not a man of few words. He had a lot to say. He waxed on. And during this time, Paul is repeating the strategy he has for Jewish evangelism, and that is using the Old Testament to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. And it says there that he explained about the kingdom of God from the law of Moses. He's going back to something they already know, that they already have a foundation in. And from the prophets, people they already venerate, if you will, respect, have confidence in. And he tried to persuade them about Jesus. He's using the book of Moses, he's using the law, he's using the prophets, he's using the patriarchs to prove Jesus. That's Paul's strategy. And it says in verse 24, well, the results are mixed. He says, some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. And this caused a bit of an internal struggle. And it says in verse 25, they disagreed among themselves and began to leave after Paul made this final statement. And this is the final salvo that Paul's going to toss at them. And he's going to say, look at your own tradition. You profess to be experts in it. If you did, you'd see the truth. And he says, the Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors when he said in Isaiah the prophet, Isaiah, what a great book. He said in Isaiah the prophet, and starting in verse 26, he quotes Isaiah 6, and it says, go to this people, those people are the Jews, then say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has been calloused, and they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. How does he heal them? He heals them through the saving grace of Christ, salvation. And they've rejected that. Paul's laying it right on them. He's taking aim and he's telling them the way it is. This is a stinging rebuke, and it gets even worse. You know, remember the Jews hated the Gentiles. They hated them so much that they wanted to kill them. That's the level of hate, the depth of hate they had. And in verse 28, it says here, therefore, Paul's saying this, therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. What a rebuke. The word here is, you rejected it, they're going to accept it. You think you're the godly people, you hate them, but they're the ones that are going to get the salvation. What a strong message. Unbelievable. Well, some translations have verse 29, others do not. I like it. It says, after he said this, the Jews left, arguing vigorously amongst themselves. Can you just imagine these guys all going out? What's this guy talking about? And others going, wow, this makes sense. And then the conclusion of the book in verse 30. For 2 whole years. I love Luke. I love his adjectives. 2 whole years. Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Paul had considerable freedom here. Considerable. He saw a lot of people, and he could speak without fear or retribution. He was accommodating all who were searching for the truth. Now, there's no record here in this book of how successful he was. There was no boasting about how well he did, but we know that there were seeds planted, and those seeds grew into a mighty, mighty force. And that, friends, is the book of the Acts of the Apostles.
Take my life.